Welcome back to another video on the Vixen Victory channel. Today we're going to be talking about Mavuika. Now we've already talked about the other characters in the past build guides, and I know it's taken a little bit of time to get this one out, so let's go ahead and just jump right in talking about her as a character. Now she's going to be a Pyro DPS. That's mainly how she's kind of fitted towards, and the major things you're going to be focusing on when looking into leveling talents is going to be her skill and her burst. Her burst is going to be the major way that you're going to be using her as like an on-field Pyro DPS type build. The skill is where you are still going to be doing a lot of your initial damage, as well as what you're going to be using as your off-field Pyro, Mavuika. Usually, basically with the skill, we'll talk about it later how that's going to work. Your skill is basically your baseline for your damage of what you're doing, and then your burst is giving you a buff based on the skill damage. So even if you are a DPS, that does not mean that you should forget about your skill at all. It does not mean that. It means if you are going for the typical DPS build, you should be leveling both the skill and the burst pretty evenly. Obviously, because the weeks have not been, enough, I have not been able to kind of level both of them evenly, but I will and kind of get them both crowned. But the normal attack talent is something you don't have to worry about. It's practically useless on our account. If you really want to, just because you have extra materials, you can go ahead and do so and get a few levels in there. But I'm just waiting to use these on future characters. So let's go ahead and talk about what her talents actually do. Her first talent or her skill is going to be basically initially doing a pyro damage hit when she uses her skill, and then she's going to go into her Night's Soul Blessing state. Looking at this skill though, you have a tap and a hold version. The tap version is going to give you a ring of searing radiance, and the ring will follow the active character and attack nearby opponents at intervals, dealing Night's Soul aligned pyro damage. This is where people are going to be using a lot of that extra kind of attacks from other characters and keeping her off field. So if you do a tap version, you're going to see this ring around her. Her Night's Soul state has started, and it's going to slowly deplete her Night's Soul points over time, and this ring is going to happen, which means that ring does follow the active character, and you can follow her Night's Soul points over here. And when this little bar is done, that's her Night's Soul. This is going to disappear. Beyond the tap version, we have the hold version of the skill. When using the hold version of the skill, you're going to basically throw up Mavuika's motorcycle. When you use the motorcycle, you can then have normal, charged, and plunging attacks that will be converted to Night's Soul aligned pyro damage, which cannot be overridden. Now that also means that when you are sprinting, you'll also have an ability to hit like pyro on opponents as you drive through them, if you are sprinting specifically. When you're in the Night's Soul Blessing state, the tap or the hold version, tapping the elemental skill can then switch from one to the other and vice versa. And the armaments will then disappear once the Night's Soul Blessing state ends and she runs out of Night's Soul points. Now specifically with that though, if we use the tap version of the skill and you said, oh, I accidentally didn't mean to do that, I want to go into the damage version, then you can immediately, or the on-field version, you can immediately tap and tap again to get out of it, tap to go back in, tap to go out, and then Night's Soul points are done and you can get out. But either way, it just means that you can go back and forth between that if you accidentally don't hold it and you accidentally hit tap and you want to do the hold, or if you accidentally held and really only wanted to tap, you can kind of bounce between them extremely easily, which is nice to see and nice to know. Now looking at the skill attributes, you have initial damage hit right here at the top, your Ring of Searing Radiance damage, which is that off-field pyro hit that she does every 2 seconds, which the interval is here, and then your Flame Strider or your bike, that is what it is called, is going to be right here, and the numbers are basically similar to what you see on a normal attack talent. The normal attack damage first hit is this much, obviously it goes down to 5-hit combo, and then your sprint damage is just lower and in between the 4th and the 5th normal attack, but the charge attack damage is mainly how you're going to be using Mavuika. She's not really a normal attack constant hitter, mainly people are using her for those charge attacks, for the higher damage hit. Looking at this though, the charge attack, the cyclic damage is basically her going in circles with the charge attack over and over again. And then the final attack damage hit is that last attack that she does in it, which I'll actually show here in a second. And then you have your Flame Strider plunge damage, which is basically just the bike's plunge damage modifier, and then the Night's Soul points that you will have at C0. Now I believe the C1 brings you to 120, but we'll talk about that with Constellations, and you do have a 15-second cooldown with the skill specifically. Now, when you are doing kind of with her, you can hold the skill and immediately go this, and then if you just hold, this is your charge attack, and you are going to be doing this, and then as soon as you end, you can just let go, and there's your big damage hit. So your kind of big damage hit kind of goes, and that's really how she works, specifically with those charge attacks. Keep in mind though, when she used her skill with the tap version, when we were done with Night's Soul, the skill ended, the Night's Soul state ended. But when you go into your hold skill, and you keep going, when you're done, this is going to deplete and it's going to start eating up your bar at the bottom. So this is only used whenever you're in your Night Strider, not when you're actually in your regular other version. So if you just wait until this is kind of depleted, you're going to see that it's going to stop and not actually deplete any points here. And as you're going to see right here, this ends and this does, and obviously this does not deplete any of your on-field points that you might need. And the reason that is because if you switch to another character that you want to use on-field, like Kanish or Mualani or something like that, or another Natlan, maybe future character that goes on-field and might want to use up your bottom bar, then they can, and Mavuika's not stealing from them. Now let's go ahead and talk about the burst. Looking at the burst, she works very differently and specifically. Basically, the amount of Night Soul points that other characters have are going to turn 1-for-1 into what's called Fighting Spirit for her. And you have up to 200 points of Fighting Spirit that you can have with your burst. So you do not get energy through your other characters to actually give Mavuika any abilities to use her burst. She only gets points by characters consuming Night Soul points. So let's say a character like Xilonen uses up 90 Night Soul points. That fills up this gauge because she immediately consumes 90 after she uses her skill and hits enemies 3 times. You'll get 90 Night Soul points turned into 90 Fighting Spirit. And that allows her to then use her burst. The thing with Mavuika is that she has 200 Fighting Spirit to actually hold at one time. When using this, obviously you can see here the maximum Fighting Spirit you can have is 200, which means Night Soul points consumed at the maximum can be 200. But it's almost interesting to an extent because you're wondering, okay, well, does that mean Mavuika can only work with other characters that are using Night Soul? Thankfully, she does technically have another way to get more Fighting Spirit. When nearby party members use normal attacks, Mavuika gains 1.5 Fighting Spirit. This is a little bit different, which means that if you get 10 normal attacks off, you're going to get 15 Fighting Spirit. So the idea is, though, that obviously Night Soul points are going to be way easier to get her Fighting Spirit, which is why characters like Xilonen and Citlali are basically going to be glued to Mavuika's hip for a lot of this if you're using her on field. If you have characters like Kanish or Mualani that also consume Night Soul points to an extent at certain times, Kanish is going to be a little bit more difficult because he only consumes 20 at a time, but it still does happen somewhat frequently. Then Mavuika can use them to actually do the consumption for getting her burst. Just keep in mind, if you want her burst and she's off field, it's going to be a little bit difficult to get the Fighting Spirit unless you're putting out about, a lot, basically like 60, 70 normal attacks in a rotation. Then you're going to be able to get some Fighting Spirit back. So that is kind of the only thing with her, is that you need a lot of Night Soul points to be consumed to make sure that she gets her burst back, which is why characters like Xilonen and Citlali, or together, work extremely well with her as a character. So that's how her burst works, but the actual burst, that's how you're going to get the Fighting Spirit to use the burst. But when you use the burst, you're going to gain 10 Night Soul points and enter the Night Soul Blessing state, and then you're going to take your Flame Strider or your bike and do a powerful Sunspell Slice, which is this big damage hit you're going to do here. Once you're done with that huge damage hit, you're then going to go into the Crucible of Death and Life state. This state is going to last 7 seconds, and while you do that, based on how many points or however many Fighting Spirit you used up, you're going to do a certain amount of damage bonus on top of the normal Flame Strider hits. So as you can see here, if you use 100 Fighting Spirit, which is the minimum that you can use to get her burst, then you're going to do 88% of her attack as a bonus on top of whatever your modifier is for whatever damage you do specifically here, whenever you're in that 7 seconds. Now, the Crucible of Death and Life duration kind of states that Mavuika's various actions will no longer consume Night Soul points. So her normal attacks or charge attacks, nothing will consume Night Soul points for those 7 seconds. And the damage dealt by Sunspell Slice, that big damage hit, and Ancient Name Unbound's normal and charge attacks, which are the charge attacks you're going to do during the burst Crucible of Death and Light state, you're going to have in here, when you're in the skill, these different normal and charge attacks, they're not going to use up any Night Soul points. But even bigger, the greatest part is that they're going to have an increased number of damage based on the amount of Fighting Spirit that she has whenever she consumes the Fighting Spirit to go into her elemental burst. So if you have one, and you need a maximum of about 50% of the bar that you need. Now, in a very basic sense, what this means is this little bar here on the bottom right, normally we see that as energy cost. Characters like Kazuha or whatever, I think he has like a 60 or an 80 energy cost. If it's 60, he needs 60 elemental energy to use his burst, and other characters can give him that energy. Mavuika, on the other hand, uses Fighting Spirit. When other characters consume Night Soul points, there'll be a 1-for-1 for the Fighting Spirit. Obviously, I already talked about the normal attacks being going for a 1 for 1.5 to actually get this. What that means is you need 100 Fighting Spirit to get to the top of this bar and use the burst. But if you want, you can wait even longer and allow these other characters to consume more Night Soul points and fill the gauge up a second time. And the more you fill it up a second time, the more damage that you're going to have done in your actual burst phase, which is exactly what this is talking about. The more Fighting Spirit that you consume by consuming more Night Soul points, the more damage you're going to do during this duration. Which would you rather have? The base of 100 to do the Fighting Spirit, or would you rather have 150 to possibly 200 to buff this even more? So what's better as a bonus to basically, let's say, this charge attack? Is it 100 for 88% of her attack, or is it 200 compared to like the 176%? That's kind of the idea, at least with the damage increase that you're going to be getting here. The more Night Soul points you consume to use your burst, the more damage that you can do with Mavuika inside of that 7 seconds for her burst. So that's kind of how her burst works. It's a very finicky, interesting burst, but that's at least how it works. Looking at the first passive talent, when nearby party members trigger a Night Soul burst, Mavuika increases her attack by 30% for 10 seconds. This is stating basically that a Night Soul burst, if you haven't heard me talk about it before, when there's a Natlan character in a party and anybody in the party does any type of elemental damage, it triggers the Night Soul burst. The initial damage hit that does not increase its own personal damage or whatever. It just triggers a lot of effects for Natlan characters, and in this state, Mavuika's attack is increased for 10 seconds. And considering if you have more Natlan characters, the Night Soul burst can trigger more frequently. If you only have one Natlan character, I believe it's an 18-second cooldown before Night Soul burst can trigger again. But more Natlan characters you have, the more frequently this can happen, which means the more frequently they can trigger their passives. Looking at this second passive talent, it states that after using her elemental burst, every point of Fighting Spirit present when it is used increases the damage that the current active party member deals by 0.2%. So she's already buffing herself by giving herself an extra attack damage bonus on top of her already given damage. But now you have an actual passive talent that can be given to herself as well as other characters. This stating that you can give a 0.2% damage buff per point of Fighting Spirit that you consume. So once again, would you rather have the minimum of 100 to use the burst to make this a 20% buff, or would you rather have a 40% buff and wait till you get 200 Fighting Spirit? Obviously, people are going to want the 200 Fighting Spirit, which means that you're going to need, once again, those characters that can consume those points or those Night Soul points way faster so that you can actually make sure to get your, on rotation, kind of get the actual Fighting Spirit that you need and want. Now, this effect lasts for 20 seconds, but it does decay over a certain duration of 20 seconds until it reaches 0 or 0%. So that is, I think it's about 2% every second for 20 seconds. So you are kind of having like a backwards decay effect compared to someone like Yelan. Yelan slowly increases her damage buff to characters over time while she's in the burst, whereas Mavuika is kind of reverse. You start at 40% and slowly go down over time. So even if you are I want to use Mavuika off field, I don't really care about the burst, still I would level it just because this specific passive talent, you're still going to be using the burst, so you might as well have the damage increase there for you. But also, if you are using this for the other characters, this is going to give them a nice damage buff initially. So the more Night Soul points that she gets, or the more Night Soul points you consume, the more Fighting Spirit that Mavuika can get, the higher damage that her burst can do, and the higher that this buff is going to be for those active characters. That includes Mavuika as well as any on-field character that you put before or after basically using the burst with Mavuika. Now let's go ahead and talk about weapons. Now there are a few different weapons that I really do think work, and honestly it's funny because I do have those 3 weapons here. Obviously her personal weapon is going to be the best weapon, does have a low crit rate, but her 4-piece kind of fixes that, and you do get 20% crit damage and 28% attack here when you use a skill or burst. So very, very easy to kind of get around that fact. Also a very nice high amount of base attack. She does extremely well off of attack, so this is an extremely strong weapon. Obviously, the rest of it is going to be pretty good for her as well. We don't really talk about it because obviously it is her personal weapon, so it is the best. Looking at Verdict though, and Wolf's Gravestone, I think these kind of tie for second best weapons when we look at weapons for Mavuika. And the reason why is because this is just a bunch of attack that you're getting off of Wolf's Gravestone, a 608 with a 49.6% attack, with 20% here and a 40% given to all party members when you are attacking opponents with 30% less HP. So that's kind of the idea. A lot of attack stats given from Wolf's Gravestone. But Verdict, on the other hand, has a little bit more crit rate, a little bit less base attack. You do get an attack buff, and if for some odd reason you have a character like Shilona in the team, which is for a good reason, and you are able to create Crystallize, if you grab those shards, your elemental skill damage is going to be increased as well. So after getting those shards, if you really want, this is going to increase your elemental skill damage, which is then going to allow her personal off-field as well as on-field, whatever. That damage is going to be increased when you're doing that elemental skill damage for her as a character. So very, very nice to see a nice damage buff even still with this weapon. It's not necessarily made for her, but it does work pretty well. There are some other weapons that do work, and if you want to put something like Fang the Mountain King, which is Kanisha's weapon, has similar stats to her personal weapon. Obviously not as good of a weapon, but it does work. And there are some other weapons that can work, you know, stat sticking weapons. Beacon of the Reed Sea is also a pretty good weapon, like 33% crit rate at level 90, and its ability just gives a bunch of attack as well. So a very, very nice kind of stat sticky weapon for her, and it works extremely well. So if you don't really use your Dia or you accidentally got the weapon, that weapon can work pretty well on her, especially if you're using Mavuika off field. Now let's look at 4 stars. Looking specifically at 4 stars, I really do like Serpent Spine and Earthshaker. Earthshaker is a very, very good weapon. I believe it's 47.6% attack at level 90, and I think it's a 565 base attack. The ability states that after triggering a pyro-related reaction, you get extra skill damage increase, so a very, very solid weapon for on and off field Mavuika. The Serpent Spine is a stat stick weapon a little bit in my opinion. You can make this work for off field, but it's a little bit better for on field because you want the character to stay on the field for a longer period of time. Also, if you're pairing her with someone like Sitlali, you're not taking any damage, and this is going to make sure that those stacks aren't going to go away in the ability. But also, you're getting a stat stick of 27.6% crit rate, 510 base attack, which is less than the other weapons, but that does mean that with this, you are basically getting yourself to like 70% crit rate with the 40% crit rate from the artifact set that you'll most likely use. So those two weapons are going to be pretty good. Obviously, you can use any other stat sticky type weapon that has crit or attack percent with them. These are just kind of the weapons that I like the most, but you can use something like Prototype Archaic or something like that to really just kind of throw in some extra just time. But remember that those are going to be the better weapons in my personal opinion. For 4 stars, Earthshaker and probably Serpent Spine right behind it, and then obviously her personal weapon with Verdict and Wolf's Gravestone being the better secondary weapons, and then Beacon of the Reed Sea is an extremely strong weapon to use, as well as Fang of the Mountain King is kind of okay. I wouldn't really say it's my favorite, especially since you have to deal like Burning and Burgeon, but that is a technical idea that you could do if you want to. Now let's go ahead and talk about artifacts. With artifacts, the 4-piece set you should be going after for the DPS route is going to be Obsidian Codex, because this doesn't work for the off the field, like off-field pyro damage dealer, because the 2-piece doesn't work very well, and neither does the 4-piece. This states the 2-piece that while the character is in the Night's Soul Blessing state and has to be on the field, their damage is going to be increased by 15%. There's on field. And the 4-piece states that after the equipping character consumes 1 Night's Soul point while on the field, crit rate will be increased by 40% for 6 seconds. So this does trigger once every second, so technically this can happen consistently and you get that 40% crit rate. But now you can see why this set really doesn't work that well with characters that are off field. Now, looking at the other set, if you want to go for an off-field, like, pyro application Mavuika, 4-piece Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City is going to work extremely well, but then we see here that it's 6 elemental energy, and we don't care about that on Mavuika. What we really care about is the 40% elemental damage bonus you're going to get from the 4-piece. Basically, this states that if you trigger a reaction with the character here, then while they're in the Night's Soul Blessing state, they're going to get 28% elemental damage bonus and an initial 12% elemental damage bonus. So because Mavuika's in the Night's Soul Blessing state with her off-field capabilities, you're going to be getting the 28% plus the base 12, which is a 40% elemental damage bonus for both characters that created the reaction. So that is 40% pyro damage bonus because Mavuika's a part of it. And let's say you used Ayato, that's a 40% hydro elemental damage bonus as well. So they're getting a little bit of buffs there, and it's extremely strong and very, very good, and we like that, and they get a lot more damage because of it. So that's also something really you could keep in mind if you really want to make sure that Mavuika is, you're getting ready to grind for it. Two piece of attack, elemental skill damage, stuff like that can work for both types of the characters, if on field or off field. But honestly, once again, you're focusing on those two 4-piece main stat sets. Now, speaking of main stats, though, let's go ahead and talk about the sands here. Looking at the sands, it's a toss-up between elemental mastery and attack percent. In my personal opinion, I like the attack percent a little bit more, but I do know that elemental mastery works extremely well and can work really, really well in specific teams, mainly focusing on like melt teams. I do use her on a melt team mostly right now, but I am hoping in the future I can get her on a team that works with overload, and we'll talk about this in the team section, but there's not really an overload team that works very well right now, so I'm keeping my attack percent sands on her right now, and obviously also my EM sands is not that great, but if you do want to use an EM sands, that is also a very, very good piece to throw on her though. And the difference between the two, I think the EM sands works a little bit better from what I've seen, but really you just have to choose. In my personal opinion, they're pretty close overall, so I would just say which one has the better stats, and obviously you can see here the one that has the better stats for me and the one I like a little bit more is the attack percent sands. I'll make sure I get an EM sands at some point just so I have the capability to kind of do both. But looking at the goblet, obviously pyro damage bonus, do not go EM, don't go attack, it's not worth it. Pyro damage bonus is going to beat it every single day of the week. Now, the circlet is something else I want to talk about. Because you get 40% crit rate on here, even if you feel like you have a little bit low crit rate, it's still probably going to be worth it just to make sure you get a crit damage circlet. If you have no other crit rate on any other piece, then I guess you can run a crit rate circlet just so that you're sitting at like a 75% or something, 76% on crit rate at the end of the day. But I do feel like most people, if they're grinding and getting ready for Mavuika, they should have some crit rate here and there for the actual character to have a little bit to make sure that they're kind of surviving somewhat. Plus, if you have a crit rate weapon, it's going to make it even easier to have to only worry about crit damage. So I think crit damage is going to be the major way people are going to play her, but if you're really suffering on a lot of crit rate specifically, or if you want just an extremely high amount of crit rate, like you like to have 90% crit rate, 100% crit rate, then running a crit rate circlet is going to be best for you. If you look at how my Mavuika is built right now, she's sitting at a 33 over 248. That basically adding the 40% is getting me a 73 over 248. If you really want to, I could easily switch over to a crit rate circlet with a bunch of crit damage on it, and that brings me over to a 57 over 207. You have to give up a lot of crit damage, about 40%, if you have a lot of crit damage on the piece itself. If not, you're giving up a bunch of crit damage, even still, to just make sure that I'm at like a 97 at the end of the day over 207. Still a very good 1-for-2 ratio, but personally, I just like to see the bigger numbers hit with the higher crit damage, so that's really what I sit at specifically. Now let's go ahead and look at Constellations. Looking at Constellations, she has very, very good Constellations across the board. Personally, I think she sits fine at C0, but she's a character that if someone told me that they stopped at any single one of these Constellations, I'd be okay with, because every single one is extremely good. Now, looking at the first constellation, it states that Mavuika's maximum Night Soul points are increased to 120, and she gains Fighting Spirit of 25% more efficiently. So instead of 80, you're now at 120 Night Soul, and the Fighting Spirit, instead of it being 1 Night Soul point for 1 Fighting Spirit, it's 1 Night Soul point for 1.25 Fighting Spirit. And instead of 1 normal attack for 1.5 Fighting Spirit, it's now 1 normal attack plus I think like 1.8 or 1.9 Fighting Spirit. I think is 25% more. So that kind of gives you a little bit more. It just makes sure that you're getting her ult back or her burst back way quicker. Additionally, she gains 40% attack for 8 seconds after gaining Fighting Spirit. If you're consuming Night Soul points from other characters, or if you are doing normal attacks at any point with any character, you're gaining Fighting Spirit. So this is constantly happening throughout the entire time of her damage route, which means she's always having basically this 40% attack buff. Looking at the C2, it states that when you're in the Night Soul Blessing state, Mavuika gains 200 base attack. Now that's base attack, which means it's adding to this number right here, not this number. Basically what that means is this would not be 2200, this would be 1299 times my bonuses of all my attack that I have, which would probably bring me to like 23, maybe 2400. So having more base attack is very, very nice to see. And it's not just a regular just stat throw on top of it. It is a very, very nice stat throw on top of it. Also, you have some different changes when you use your skill into your Night Soul Blessing state. So with the Ring of Searing Radiance, which is that tap version of the skill with the little ring behind her, nearby opponents' defense is decreased by 20%. So very, very good for that on-field character that you might be pairing with Mavuika to make sure she's doing more damage. Also with the Flame Strider, so on-field Mavuika's normal attacks, charge attacks, and her Sunfell Slice from the Elemental Burst deal 60% for the charge attacks of her attack as increased damage, 90% of her attack as increased damage for her charge attacks, and 120% of her attack as increased damage for her Elemental Burst Sunfell Slice. So a very, very nice damage increase to what she's going to do in her burst state. Looking at the C3, we're increasing the level of the burst again, maxing out all those numbers that we already saw in the talent attributes that we saw there with the skill attributes. The numbers, all the scalings go higher. And then with the C5, same thing, but with the skill. Now, the Constellation 4 states that it enhances the effects of the passive talent that she has. And that was that decay effect I was talking about. So the more Night Soul that more characters give, the more fighting spirit she has. But specifically, it's the more fighting spirit she has that she consumes, the bigger the damage buff that she gives to the on-field character. And then, but it does mean that it does decay over time. This states that buff that you get, the damage increase, does not decay over time now, and it has an additional 10% on top of it. So instead of 40%, it's now 50%, and that 50% number doesn't change at all. Obviously, you have to have the first passive talent to actually use it, but that C4 is extremely strong. Now looking at the 6th Constellation, it states that the all fire armaments from the elemental skill, the Name Moment, receive all around improvements. The Ring of Searing Radiance states that when the ring's attacks hit opponents, a Flame Strider will crash into the struck opponent, dealing 200% of attack as Night Soul aligned AoE Pyro damage. So a big damage hit whenever she already does her damage from off field. The Flame Strider, or her bike mode, when Mavuika is riding the Flame Strider, she will also summon a Scorching Ring of Searing Radiance to follow her, which will decrease nearby opponents' defense by 20%. That's really strong, and deal 500% of her attack as Night Soul aligned AoE Pyro damage to nearby opponents once every 3 seconds. Really, what that means is that means that the buffs that you get from the skill, like obviously now she just has the skill active while she does the burst, and that also means that she kind of has a huge damage hit happening whenever it's almost like having the burst trigger every few seconds with her skill. So whenever it's the tap, so the skill and the tap and the hold version are both happening almost at the same time with this idea happening, and that's really, really nice. Either way it happens, you're getting a nice buff either way. Looking at the end, it states that additionally, when Mavuika is riding her Flame Strider and is not in combat, when her Night Soul points drop to 5, she will gain 80 Night Soul points, and this effect can trigger once every 15 seconds. So if you ever get down to no Night Soul points, then you can just know that you'll get some extra Night Soul points, which allows it to extend it even further to allow her to stay in that Night Soul Blessing state. Now let's look at teams. Now, teams are very specific, and there's a lot of teams that I tried to run through. What I found in my testing is that overload teams were extremely difficult because you couldn't keep a character like Sitlali or Shilonen in the team. Because of how like Chevreuse works, where she only wants Pyro and Electro characters in the team to give her buffs, you're actively getting rid of that buff to then make sure that you're getting these characters. Now, the reason why Sitlali and or Shilonen work extremely well with Mavuika is because they are practically the only characters that can consume Night Soul really fast enough and well enough for Mavuika to use, if she's an on-field character. Even still with the other characters, it can be pretty difficult. I think Mualani kind of works the best if you're looking for like an off-field Mavuika. Mualani is kind of better than Kanish in that aspect as well. But overall, if you have Shilonen, in my personal opinion, is going to be a better, like, if you have to choose one support to put with Mavuika, Shilonen is going to be #1 option. Behind that is going to be Sitlali. The only reason I say behind that is just because of everything else that Shilonen can do, I think puts her a little bit above Sitlali. But if you have both characters, your Mavuika is going to hit skyrocket limits that you've never even seen before. keep that in mind when you're kind of running this kind of team together. You could also run easily teams without Shilonen and, you know, kind of an extra character here, but if you can easily run just these two together, or you can just run these characters as well and just throw in extra slots. Now, if you want the Pyro resonance to give 2 Pyro characters like a Bennett or something like that, you could throw in a Bennett. From what I've found, especially when we're looking at like melt teams, the best team that I've found to consistently melt is something like this.
Can't sleep.
Now, Layla can be switched out for another cryo unit like Rosaria or Charlotte or Diona or something like that to just have consistent cryo coming from off field if you really want to. But Layla worked pretty well for me. We're having 2 shielders, which is also kind of cool, and a healer, so there is no shot that any character is dying on this team. But we're having constant reactions happen. Also, this allows you to play a little bit lower crit rate on Mavuika, because you're getting some extra crit rate from this specific thing here. If your opponents are affected by cryo, which with the amount of cryo that's happening here, that should be happening pretty consistently. So you're getting some extra crit rate buffs based on that as well. So I do think that this is a pretty strong team, and I really do like it. If you don't want to play the double cryo, throw in a swirler like Kazuha, like Venti, like Sucrose, like Jean. Any of those characters can work to kind of slip in and kind of swap out with the extra cryo unit that I had here originally. But also Kazuha was probably the other character that I would use, just because Kazuha and Shilona work so well to buff one character that works pretty well. But keep in mind that I did find that I was melting way less because only Sitlali was the only one allowing the melt to happen. So that is kind of the only difference, I would say. If you're looking for a melt team, double cryo with Shilonen or double cryo with some extra buffer, and you could do 2 pyros and 2 cryos even. If you say I don't have Shilonen, but you said that, you know, these 2 characters work fine together without it, I want to use 2 cryos and 2 pyros, you could throw in Layla, and you could throw in, let's say, Bennett at the end. So this also works pretty well. You have 2 shielders and a healer technically still. You're getting an attack buff, you're getting the resonance happening, both of them happening at the same time, which is allowing a big heal buff as well as an attack buff to Mavuika. And Sitlali is also pretty helpful as well, considering you have obviously what she's already doing for Mavuika, but she's also allowing and working with Layla to make sure that Mavuika's melting. So a lot of strong opportunities and a lot of different teams, I think, overall with her as a character, especially when we look at that team. Now, if you want to kind of use her with, like, you know, another team to kind of have like a freeze melt kind of vibe going on, you need a character, because with Mavuika, you always want to do charge attacks in her burst or in her skill form, whatever. When she's on her flame strider, you always want to really do charge attacks. So characters like Xingqiu and Yelan aren't going to work that well to constantly put Hydro out to vaporize. So characters like Farina or Kokomi or whatever that have off-field Hydro application are going to be pretty strong for you here if you want to do some sort of freeze melt idea with these characters. Also, Farina is really, really good for having the ability to actually give a huge damage buff to everybody as well. Now, you could say, you know what, I just want to kind of vaporize team. Technically, this can also work as well, kind of just having Shilonen and Farina, but making sure every single time you're seeing Shilonen or Sitlali in the team with Mavuika, or you're seeing both of them there, to make sure that you're having enough Night Soul to kind of make it work. Now, on the other hand, I've even seen plenty of times that I don't build for an off-field Mavuika, but I've seen some pretty strong, you know, damage numbers actually happen. I've seen like 60Ks happen from off-field on vaporizes on this specific team. Now, this team works extremely well, but is a very expensive team, so keep that in mind. If you do have Neuvillette, Farina, Mavuika, and Shilonen, and you want to run her off-field, it works really well. And technically, if Neuvillette's like in a cooldown for some odd reason and somehow doesn't kill everything within sight with this team, you could just switch over to Mavuika and have her go on field for the 7 seconds during her ultimate, or her burst, which is allowing a lot of extra time for these characters to kind of have some uptimes, as well as allows Shilonen to actually make use of her consumption of Night Soul for Mavuika. Also, once again, the whole point of that second passive talent with her burst is, yes, to buff Mavuika, but it's also to buff the on-field character. So in this team, if Mavuika's not really there all the time, what I would say to do is to initially start out, if you can, eventually at some point, try to get Mavuika's burst out first, to just do a bunch of pyro attacks over and over again. But really, the big point is just to have Shilonen go out and Farina go out, do their buffing starts, and then go to Mavuika and immediately use her burst. Because at that point, then you're using up your burst, and after that point, because we talked about this in her second passive, the on-field character afterwards is going to get this damage increase. So every point of fighting spirit present when it is used increases the damage of the active party member. So if you want to be smart here and actually buff the on-field character that's coming on after Mavuika, you want to use your supports, then Mavuika use her ultimate and immediately switch, maybe tap your skill again or something, and immediately switch off and go to someone like Neuvillette so that he can get that huge damage buff because he's the active character now, giving him a huge damage buff, and it does, decrease over time, but it is still very nice to have for these characters. Other teams that did work, I used Child. Child worked pretty well with different teams as well. Obviously with Mavuika, I used Shilonen, and I did even switch over to a Sitlali as well with Child. That worked pretty well. I'm sure characters like Ayato are absolutely going to love it. I did use him as an example. You can try to make an Overload team work. Personally, I haven't seen any other team that's really worked with Overload just because there's no other Pyro or Electro character that consumes Night Soul points fast enough for what I would want. Hopefully we get another character like that in the future. But if you guys do find any other teams, I've tried a lot of them, and obviously because this video is already so long, I didn't want to throw in any other teams, but if you guys have any other teams that you guys think should be kind of mentioned here, go ahead and let me know down in the comments, and we can kind of share together with the community what we think overall.
Your coming was foretold.
Dance with me! The show's only just begun. Not done yet.
The eternal awaits long lives.
Catch this!
Rise with the sun.
The curtain falls.
Well, that's everything I've got talking about Mavuika in this video. If you guys did like the video, please go ahead and like and subscribe. Let me know what else you guys think about Mavuika, maybe other teams or ideas or kind of kits or maybe other characters that you think might work better with her. Go ahead and let me know down below. Thank you guys for watching the video once again, and I'll see you guys in the next one.